Well, the decision to raise the terror threat level is a move the Albanese government and security agencies should have made months ago. Albanese tried to shift the blame for this, saying it was a global trend, while insisting that social cohesion in Australia is something he wants to protect. Yet his own government has done the precise opposite, importing more hatred from the front line of Gaza while fueling violence with their anti-Israel rhetoric. Albanese today spoke about social cohesion.
Our words and our actions matter. Social cohesion cannot be taken for granted. It must be nourished and it must be cherished as a national asset.
Well, is he nourishing, as he says, social cohesion when he brought in more than 1,100 people from Gaza, people who may be indoctrinated to hate Westerners and Jews from the moment of birth, people who don't remotely share our values of tolerance, equality and free speech, and people who largely support Hamas. Hamas, a terror organisation that slaughters babies, children and pregnant women and celebrates this murder. Albanese needs to take a hard look at his own overarching strategy, because today he claimed to care about the safety of Australians.
My government's first priority is the safety and security of Australians.
But if that were the case, if he was genuinely worried about our safety, then how could he possibly bring to our safe country people who could be affiliated with Hamas, who could pose a threat to our national security? Earlier this year, I exposed at least one man who came here with a visa granted by the Albanese government, who had liked numerous posts supporting the terror attacks of October 7. And our revelation tonight that the Albanese government has granted a 21-year-old Hamas sympathiser a visa calls into question the adequacy of their security checks. And their security screening is far from adequate, as we've spoken about here numerous times. Some of these visas were granted in as little as 1 hour.
Some individuals claim their visitor visa for relatives were approved within 1 hour.
It is possible.
Sure, but how could you possibly do all the necessary security and other checks in just an hour from an applicant? I mean, that's lightning speed approval.
When we apply that vast range of information to consideration of visitor visas. So if you look globally, a very large number of our visitor visas would be done inside an hour. The assessment is essentially looking at all the information we hold and applying that in a number of ways to the application in front of us.
And Shadow Home Affairs Minister James Paterson, who was doing that questioning there, he's going to be on my show tonight to react to the news that our terror threat level is now probable. Well, today, ASIO boss Mike Burgess said politically motivated violence is part of the reason for the increased threat.
You've heard me say many times that espionage and foreign interference are our principal security concerns. ASIO's intelligence suggests that is no longer accurate. While the threats to our way of life remain elevated, we are seeing an increase in extremism. More Australians are being radicalised and radicalised more quickly. More Australians are embracing a more diverse range of extreme ideologies, and more Australians are willing to use violence to advance their cause.
And Mike Burgess, the ASIO boss, spoke about the normalisation of inflammatory protests.
Politically motivated violence encompasses terrorism, but is broader than that. It covers any violent act or any violent threat intended or likely to achieve a political objective. This includes violent protest, riot or an attack on a politician or our democratic institutions. This trend increased during COVID, gained further momentum after the terrorist attacks in Israel, and accelerated during Israel's military response.
Well, politically motivated violence escalated on October 8th, as he just said, and that's when they should have raised the terror threat level. But finally, belatedly, the Prime Minister raised it today in an announcement he didn't seem to want to make, while continuing to bring in more Palestinians who may have extreme ideologies from the front line in Gaza. Now, a terror threat level of probable means that ASIO believes there is a greater than 50% chance of a terror attack or its planning occurring in the next 12 months. And Burgess said Gaza was a significant driver of the terror threat level. And when he was asked by a journalist who were the targets, he indicated it could be either the Jewish or Islamic communities. Have a look.
Gaza is not the cause of this rising, but actually I acknowledge, yes, it's a significant driver. It's driven more emotion and heat into society. In terms of where this is going, it's across the board. Yes, there's plenty of anti-Semitism, but there's plenty of Islamophobia at the same time.
That is a serious erosion in social cohesion here in Australia, on our streets. We know this has been happening, but the Prime Minister tried to shift the blame away from his own government for this rise in violence that we're seeing. He just claimed it was part of a global trend.
There are many things driving this global trend towards violence. Governments around the world are concerned about youth radicalisation, online radicalisation, and the rise of new mixed ideologies.
But we've spoken on many occasions about how Albanese and his ministers are, in fact, fueling anti-Israel sentiment by wrongly indicating that Israel hasn't been acting in accordance with humanitarian law. The criticism of Israel, which is trying to eliminate terrorists, has been over the top from the Albanese government. And this has only inflamed the anti-Semitism that we've seen. And on the weekend, Ed Husic, one of Albanese's team, wouldn't even say that the hate preachers are spreading anti-Semitism. The Sunday Telegraph reported, when pressed about the rise of anti-Semitic hate speech in Australia amid the ongoing war overseas, Husic downplays the influence of radical Islamic preachers. Well, right now, these are the hate preachers that Ed Husic is downplaying.
The invading Jews, we say, by Allah, the day you will be kicked out of Palestine is coming. It's a day of pride! It's a day of victory!
Ed Husic could have easily chosen to strongly condemn the hate preachers in that interview because they did celebrate the mass slaughter of October 7. At a time when the terror threat level is rising, the Albanese government is, in my view, only making the threat to Australians worse by refusing to shut down the extremists and by bringing in, straight from the war zone, people who hate everything we stand for, especially when the security checks are far from adequate to make sure that those granted visas don't support extremist views and won't take part in violence. Now, back in November, the Prime Minister insisted the Palestinians they were flying into Australia would be here temporarily, just visitor visas.
These are not permanent visas. These are temporary visas. There are the same security checks that are in place for people, for Australians, that have been in place, this regime, for a long period of time.
Well, you heard it there, just temporary, not permanent. But then yesterday, Tony Burke, the new Immigration Minister, had a different message. He said that there were no plans to send the Palestinians back to Gaza.
Obviously, in all of this, we're in a situation, as is every country in the world, where people have fled, where no country in the world is sending people back to Gaza at the moment for obvious reasons. So we have to work through what is the appropriate visa to be able to consider for these individuals. No country in the world would send people back to Gaza at the moment. No country in the world would do that. And so we have to work through what happens as the visas that people are currently on expires.
No less than the Prime Minister assured Australians this was just temporary. And now Burke's saying effectively he's going to look at other visa types. This was never temporary. The Prime Minister lied. And all of this at a time when the terror threat level is rising and some Australians are feeling extremely unsafe. Security experts, by the way, are also worried about these new visas. Here was Michael Shoebridge, the Director of Strategic Analysis Australia, on with my colleague Peter Credlin earlier.
It's an unfortunate fact that polls of Palestinians in Gaza and the West Bank say over 50% of them support armed struggle and around 40% of them are Hamas supporters. Now, anyone who supports armed struggle and/or Hamas is not the kind of person we want in our community, stoking more anger and division. That's the problem.
If there was a more cautious approach with more rigorous security checks, there might be more confidence in the Albanese government. But they're being far from cautious. They're rushing the visa process despite the very real, very tangible risks. Well, what will Albanese say if, God forbid, there's an attack by someone they've brought in from the war zone, someone who doesn't share our Australian values? Well, they're not going to apologise, just like the government didn't apologise when a Perth grandmother was bashed by a released detainee. They'll say they can't comment because it's before the courts, and they'll accuse anyone who criticises them of politicising terror. But when social cohesion is at tipping point, when violence is bubbling over, the Albanese government needs to take a far more vigilant approach to our security. And if they refuse to do so, the intelligence agencies should intervene before this government makes a fatal error and grants a permanent visa to a violent Hamas supporter.